Hello. Okay, there's two of us back.
I think there's some problems, so...
Hello?
Hi.
Hello again.
Hello?
Hello.
People, not quite sure what happened there. Got muted.
Well, we couldn't hear you at all.
Okay. Was just
I think
me.
it's when you talk over the echo. We lose. That's why you can hear the first half of the sentence, but you can't hear the second because it's the echo from the first. I think.
Okay. Well, what we should do is get on with it. Get some other people talking, right? Yes. Well,
Hang on,
welcome to
Samina's typing quickly.
sorry, people out there in the world. This is very what I'm going to do. So, I think what we should do.
Oh,
Right. Okay. Here we are. Webinar 1. Right. Three people today. Stott, Melanie Edgar, Josephine Walker, and give us a perspective from PhD. Talk to us. Those slides, like, over to you. What do you hear? Okay.
Okay. I'll start, shall I? I'll start. I've got a thumbs up from Will, a thumbs up from Samina, hopefully. Okay. I'm gonna get it on the roll. Okay. So I don't have any slides for my presentation. And what I'm going to do is I'm essentially going to tell just a few stories that tie in with some of the questions that that people have asked, that relate to kind of like hypothetical situations of PhD students and supervisors. So the first question that I have been asked to address is what's the role of the first and second supervisors? So I think first of all, throughout my talk, there's going to be definitely a theme of that it's very unique to the person being supervised and to the supervisor as well. So I think that the role of the first and second supervisors can be very, very flexible. And in my case, my first and second supervisors were, I would say, almost equal. I had one supervisor based in biology department and one supervisor based in maths department. And half of my PhD was focused on mathematical methods for population biology, and half of my PhD was focused on using those methods to understand biological phenomena. So for me, I would say my supervisors ended up being quite equal. For lots of other people, the roles can be very unequal. So you'll have a first supervisor who deals with nearly all of the research side of stuff, a second supervisor who will pitch in terms of their specialist area, or perhaps your second supervisor will work with you specifically on certain chapters or certain methods or something like that. And then in other situations, you might find that the first supervisor is more of a kind of scientific person, and the second supervisor is more of a support person, I suppose. And that the first supervisor will deal with like the scientific questions, the second supervisor will deal with the kind of more technical things, I guess, of your PhD, you know, managing it. And if you have any questions that you don't want to go to your first supervisor with, you might go to your second supervisor. So I would say there's no hard and fast rules, and it depends on a number of things. It depends on the people themselves. It depends on the institution. So different institutions will often have different ways of doing this, and it also depends on the country. So, for example, in some places you might not even have a second supervisor. You might only have a first supervisor. I think that's relatively unusual, but I have heard of it happening. And in some places you might have 3 supervisors or even 4 supervisors, and then their roles will be tailored to the PhD specifically. And often when you find that's the case, you'll have a third supervisor, say in industry, or in a specific organization, or in a government organization, a non-government organization. And this definitely be the case when you have what they would used to call case PhD studentships, where a university combines with a business or an organization. So if you're looking for a PhD, then I would probably recommend to, and that's one of your concerns, I'd probably recommend to ask around. So either ask in the interview about supervisor and roles, or look on the university's website to see what their policy is, and something like that. So I'll move on to the second question now that I've been tasked with. What should you consider before picking a supervisor? So I think that, first of all, it's obvious to lots of people that you don't necessarily get to pick your supervisor. For a lot of PhDs, you apply to the project, and that project comes with a certain supervisor. So of course you could perhaps pick your supervisor by picking your project, but I would say that, you know, almost always for a PhD applicant, the project is going to come first. But then there are cases where you might actually be able to pick a supervisor. So one person that I know, or several people that I know actually, they have applied to certain PhD, I don't know what you would call them, schemes. So organizations, large organizations or consortia might run PhD programs, and you can apply with a specific project outline, and then you can choose your supervisor, sort of within that consortium of universities or research institutes or something. So in that case, you will be picking a PhD supervisor, and in some cases you might be able to pick a second supervisor if that isn't already allocated as well. And I think that the first thing you need to think about if you are picking a supervisor, if you're in a situation where you do get to do that, is the match to your research. So you want to have someone who's going to understand the research that you're doing. You want to understand someone, you want to have someone who is going to understand all the methods, that's going to understand the pitfalls and some of the problems that you might come up against, who's going to know where to be pitching your results to in terms of journals, and various things like that. So I would say that the number one thing you need to think about is the scientific match. And then after that, I would say the personal match. And really that leads me then onto my next three topics, which are going to be about communication, handling problems, and then a third one about managing supervisors. So I'll go into these saying that the PhD supervisor-supervisee role is quite unique in my opinion. I think that maybe you might have similar things in certain areas of business, but it's a really interesting dynamic where you're doing a PhD that is your PhD. It determines your future in many senses, and you're working with like one person or maybe two other people who control that whole process. And sometimes it's true that the needs of the supervisor and the needs of the supervisee are not necessarily going to match. And so I think that it's a common problem, but I think there are easy ways to deal with that. I also think, sorry, I'm getting quite a lot of feedback from someone here. That's a bit distracting. So I lost my train of thought. Yeah, so it's an interesting dynamic. And then the other thing is that you might want your project to go in one direction, your supervisor might want it to go in another direction. And so having a good personal match, I think, is quite important. And often it is luck of the draw if you're picking certain projects over a supervisor specifically. But when you do come up against problems, there are ways to deal with it. So scientific match first, but personal match, and point number one for personal match is communication. And so we're dealing with here the method, the frequency, office hours, and remote working. And as I said right at the beginning, I think that it's very unique to the situation. So, for example, I have some friends who are being supervised by people who are very, very successful, very, very busy people. They've been in science for a long time. They are professors. They're heading up departments, or they're heading up research institutes. They don't have an awful lot of time. They, as well as dealing with all these things, they often have a big group. And so in that situation, communication for those friends of mine has to be quite rigid. It has to be, if you want a meeting, you need to send an email often to a PA. You need to book an appointment. You might only get half an hour. You need to go into that appointment knowing exactly what you're going to say, knowing exactly what results you want to present, knowing exactly what problems you want to talk about, because you don't get an awful lot of time. On the other hand, I know other people who have been supervised by people much more early on in their career. They have an awful lot more time, and so for those people, it's a case of just popping down the corridor. Do you want to go and grab a coffee? Do you want to chat about this? So in that case, the method, frequency, and the office hours can really vary. And so that's something you might want to consider when you're applying for a PhD. Is this person going to be frequently in? Are they going to be available in person, or am I going to have to make sure that I am really regimented? And if you're a bit like me and you're not very good at being regimented, and you know, you have sort of these ideas that come to you and you suddenly want to chat to someone about it, then you might want to think, well, perhaps someone who is in a department or an institute is not the right person, even if they are like, you know, they'd be amazing to have them on my CV, then perhaps they're not the right person because we're not going to be able to work very well together. And even aside from those things, people have different preferences. Now, my opinion is that a really good manager is able to be flexible about how they deal with people, and so would, if you had a very, very good manager as your PhD supervisor, then they would be able to fit to your own needs, even if they were completely different from someone else that your supervisor was supervising. But the reality is that there are constraints, as in sort of the time that people have and the other things that people have going on. And also people just have personal preferences. So, for example, I have one friend whose PhD supervisor would like her to be in every day at 8 a.m. and check in. I think personally that's unusual. I haven't seen that before, but that's how they work. You know, if you're someone who is not going to be functioning very well under that regimented kind of way of working, then perhaps that's not for you. On the other hand, perhaps you're someone who needs discipline. Perhaps you're someone who works a bit better when you know you have goals to work towards, when you know that you have certain hours to be in the office, and then perhaps that is for you. For me, I like being able, I think science is creative, and I like to be able to work at different times and in different places, and so my PhD supervisor was very good to me. He allowed me to you know, work my own hours, and if I wanted to work at home, I work at home. If I wanted to work at work, I work at work, and or in a cafe or something like that. And for me, that's where my best ideas come from, and so I work quite well that way. So if you're a person like that, then maybe you need to be with someone who has a little bit of flexibility. And of course, there are other situations to think about, like perhaps you have a family, perhaps you might need to work remotely sometimes, in which case you're going to have to make sure you have a PhD supervisor who is okay with that. And so it is very, very situation dependent. But I also think that it's one of the things that PhD students end up talking the most about, because it's a very unique situation to be in, when often you can choose the hours that you work, and sometimes what you want is maybe not, or what you think you want is maybe not best for you. So consider that if you are someone who finds it hard to motivate yourself, and I've had friends who found this as well, they think that they want to have this flexibility, and then when they actually get to the PhD, they find that they aren't as kind of strict with themselves as they should be, and so perhaps they need a supervisor who's a little bit more kind of like, I need this by then, I need to see you in the office at these times, sort of thing. So think a little bit more broad, you know, quite broadly in what, not just what you want, but what might be good for you as a person. That moves me on to identifying and handling pitfalls in PhD supervision. In this case, and it does happen, I've had plenty of people who have had problems with their PhD supervisor, and it might be something very minor, and it might be something very major. It can be a stressful thing, a PhD, and I think actually in this case, it's not so much the supervisor that you want to be thinking about, it's the support network that the university has, or the research institute has in place for those sorts of things. I know of people who have come in under, you know, huge problems with their whole PhD, and there hasn't been the support networks in place to deal with that. There's no tutors, there's no mentoring, and I think that's terrible, and I think that it's something that you should definitely research before you go into the PhD, because every university does things differently, and I think if they have a good mentoring scheme or tutoring scheme, then hopefully you should be supported if you do come up against any problems. And those problems can be unforeseen as well. You might start a PhD and then it turns out that your PhD supervisor moves to a different place, or perhaps they leave their job. They decide they don't want to be in science anymore. I've heard of these things happening too. And so you want to make sure in those situations that you're going to be supported, and that you're going to be assigned new supervisors, or that everything's in place for you to move to the new institute. Because I have known, like I said, people where this has happened, and mostly it all turns out fine in the end. But the places that have better support systems are always the ones that can deal with these kind of unforeseen things better. And then know the support system as well. You usually get a handbook or something, or you get links to university websites. When it comes to identifying and handling pitfalls in PhD supervision, if you know the system really well, then you should be able to do it, work your way through that really well as well. And then the last question I have is about managing supervisors when doing an interdisciplinary PhD. I might generalize this to managing supervisors just generally. The interesting thing about interdisciplinary PhDs specifically is that often you'll end up with supervisors who see the world in very different ways. And so you might have a chapter that you're working on or a question that you're working on, and it will, you'll go to one supervisor and they'll go, oh yeah, that's amazing, we're going to do this. And then you'll go to the other supervisor and they'll go, oh yeah, that's amazing, we're going to do this. And these two things that they've suggested are completely different. I've known people, and this doesn't just apply to interdisciplinary PhDs. I think that it is common in interdisciplinary PhDs because people in different disciplines tend to think in different ways, but you might even have different supervisors in one discipline who think in different ways as well. What you don't want to end up doing is going from one to the other, redoing things all the time. Okay, and there are people I've known who have ended up doing this. I think you need to be quite confident about making sure that everyone knows what's going on. Try and get all your supervisors in a room together, one place at one time, because otherwise, if your supervisors have something to argue out between them, they end up arguing it out through you, and you're passing messages between them all the time, and that's no good for anyone. So in terms of managing supervisors generally, but specifically for an interdisciplinary PhD, I would say try and make sure that everyone is always communicating together, whether that's by email or whether that's in person, whatever, because then at least everyone knows what's going on and you don't end up being a bit of a go-between. And so that kind of summarizes sort of the questions that I've been asked to address. I think that my general points on this is that it's very, very dependent on the situation. It's not just dependent on the situation of the supervisee, it's also dependent on the situation of the supervisor. So if you have a supervisor with young kids, they probably are going to want to go and pick them up from school, and they're not going to be available after 3:30, 4 o'clock every day. And if that's when you're arriving at work, because some PhD students work like that, then there's going to be a bit of a disconnect there. So I think you've got to work together. I think that you've got to be kind of aware of each other's situations. I think that if there are problems, you should make sure that the right systems are there in place to deal with those. And I think that communication is really key. So making sure that everyone knows what's going on, that you're keeping everybody up to date is very important. And I think my one top tip when it was to go with your gut instinct, right? So if you do have flexibility in choosing your PhD and your gut instinct makes you feel, no, this person is not going to be a very good scientific match, no, this person is not going to be a very good personal match, then go with that. And that actually goes for every job, every PhD that you'd ever apply for. Be a little bit honest with yourself about that. And I think that probably ends my section there. So a few stories from myself and people that I know, and hopefully some good tips for you guys out there who are thinking about doing a PhD.
Can anybody hear me? No. Okay. Well, summary from Iain down there. Summary from Iain down there. Thank you, Iain.
Okay. Hi. So yeah, I'll just introduce myself really quickly, as I'm guessing most people can't hear Will in the corner. So I'm just doing a PhD. I've just started my second year at Manchester University, looking at grazing livestock impacts on soil carbon and greenhouse gas emissions. I'm actually a case student, which Iain mentioned briefly earlier, which means that I have multiple industrial partners. I have supervisors within the industry, supervisors within the university, which can make managing everything quite fun. But it means that I've experienced pretty much every supervisor related issue on the planet. But what I'm going to talk to you about today is actually to go back to the beginning and kind of explain how I recommend that you select your PhD, and also how that feeds back to looking at what supervisor is appropriate for you. So I'm going to base this on advice I was given 2 years ago by my master's supervisor, who was a great inspiration, is probably the reason I'm doing the PhD I'm doing right now, purely because he gave me this first very key bit of advice, which is when you're looking for a PhD, don't restrict yourself too much. I worked with colleagues who had a really specific idea during their masters of exactly what they wanted their PhD to be, and some exactly what they wanted to do that other people were interested in and was prepared to fund. So my master supervisor sort of said to me, pick a broad area. In his case, conservation farmers to try and find a way of helping them to improve their animal welfare and their overall farm management, with a scientific basis behind it, and kind of help them to get the most out of their farms in a sustainable way. Which sounds quite specific, but actually is really broad, and it encompasses PhDs on animal, PhDs on soil quality, which is actually what I ended up doing, but also PhDs on management and economic handling of animals and various other things. So I narrowed it down a little bit by knowing that I didn't want to do crop science, because I am not a plant person. So I knew I wanted to do livestock agricultural biology, and I just did a general word search that were appropriate for the PhD. So things like, I started off with scientific terms, things like foraging ecology or foraging behaviour, and in the end I actually found my current PhD that I'm doing now by typing sheep PhD 2014 into Google. So don't be afraid to look around and type some sort of strange keywords in to try and get a list of PhDs that are interesting. Once you've got that list of PhDs that you might be interested in, which you might compile over a course of several months, then you can start to look at which PhDs you'd actually want to do within that list, i.e. which ones contain all the things that you'd be interested in, and also look into the supervisors themselves. Now, when I originally started applying for PhDs, I didn't really consider the supervisor important at all. I just applied for PhDs that I was interested in, and actually it was again my master supervisor who went back and sort of said, no, you want to look carefully at the supervisor themselves. And he gave me a really interesting but possibly slightly controversial way of looking at PhD supervisors, which was to find the supervisor's webpage on the university and have a look at a couple of things. Have a look at whether they've got lots of students. Like Iain was saying earlier, PhD supervisors with lots of students can sometimes be exceptionally busy, particularly if they've also got lots of external commitments. However, as a cautionary note on that one, it can also mean that there's other students around to support you as well. So just because you can't talk to your supervisor doesn't mean you can't talk to a postdoc or a PhD student that's slightly ahead of you, to give you more of an idea, and they can bounce ideas off of you, and give you advice on things as well. But also, when you've got this page up for your potential supervisor, have a look at their publications list. This will tell you a lot of things. It'll tell you how broad their research interests are, which might give you an idea of how flexible the content of the PhD itself is. Obviously, if they work on a really specific, let's say a really specific species of fungus or specific animal, you might not be able to broaden the PhD to what you want it to be. But if they work on animal biology in general, or genetics in general, there's quite often quite a lot of room for flexibility. It'll also give you an idea of where they publish, although don't get overly hung up on that too much. But the most important piece of advice that my master supervisor gave me, which is somewhat controversial, is have a look at the authorship order. When you get to the end of your PhD, you really want to, I notice Will's smiling now, you really want to make sure that you get publications out of your PhD. And the most important thing, if you want to continue on into academia and you go for postdoc positions, or even fellowships, people are going to look at your past publication record. And you really want out of your PhD to have some good first author papers. Now, there's a lot of debate about who should be author on papers. In general, the first author is the person who does work. The last author is the leading supervisor or principal investigator, depending on what you want to call them. And the authors in the middle are generally people who contributed to specific parts of the project or advised on specific aspects. Most academics are really good now at giving PhD students and postdoctoral students first authorship on work that they've done. But there is still the odd exception to the rule, and if you spot a lot of publications in a list that are all first authored by your supervisor, maybe watch the alarm bells ringing a little bit. It's just a general piece of advice. It doesn't always hold true. Obviously, if you've got a supervisor who's very early on in their career, they're bound to be first author for a lot more papers than senior professors will necessarily be. But it's just a really quick way of gauging whether their students are getting sort of credit almost for the kind of work that they're doing. It's also really interesting while you're on those pages to look at your supervisor's external roles. Maybe they are a reviewer on a journal, or maybe they actually work for one of the funding boards, or they have affiliations with industry. And depending on where you want your career to go, those connections with your supervisor can also become your connections during the PhD. Supervisors are great for introducing you to people that you need to know, and it's an absolutely fantastic way of kind of getting an idea of where your supervisor sits within everything. And that's kind of the things that I recommend you do before you apply. And when you start, and that should give you an idea of which supervisors look good. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't apply for interviews for supervisors that you're not sure about or that don't have all the sort of external stuff. But the other key piece of advice I would give you is when you apply, if you get to the interview stage, use that to suss out how well balanced you and your supervisor are going to be. Meeting someone personally or meeting someone face to face or even doing a telephone interview will give you an awful lot of kind of idea of whether you'll get on and you'll click. I know I did, how many interviews? I did 7 interviews, I think, for PhDs in the end. And some of them you sort of got in and you knew you were going to be fine and you generally had a coffee and a chat and a laugh about something. And some of them were very, very formal and very strict, which is not so much my style, but would probably suit some other people. I'm more of a work over coffee at 9 o'clock at night and have random ideas kind of person. But you'll get much of an idea face to face as to whether you sort of match up and suit one another. And don't be afraid to ask them questions when you get to interview, like Iain was saying, about their style and you know, whether they would expect you to be in. I work really nicely, quite flexibly. I have, as I said, multiple industrial partners, so my working hours can be a bit sporadic and include weekends and various other things. But I have colleagues with different supervisors who are expected to be in from 9 a.m. till minimum 5 p.m. and they check in with their supervisor, and they're asked if they're not sat in their office, they're immediately emailed to find out where they are. So depending on what level of supervision you want, that can be quite an interesting question to kind of find out when your supervisor is likely to be around, but also ask them about conferences and presenting things. And if you've got industrial partners like I have when you get to interview, they probably won't be at your interview specifically unless they've requested to be there. So feel free to ask the supervisor that is present at your interview about who owns the rights to things like the data and what role the partners as supervisors will play within the PhD itself. And then just make sure that you try and get on with your supervisor to the best of your ability. I guess there's another piece of advice. Everyone works slightly differently. There'll always be days where you disagree with how to do something. But most supervisors I come across, the best thing you can find in a supervisor is somebody who's prepared to debate it with you. So if you go to them with an idea, they don't say no. They'll sit down and you'll go through why it's a good idea, why it's a bad idea, and they'll give you time to kind of pitch things. And I think that's the best aspect of having a good sort of supervisor-student relationship, is you can kind of bounce ideas off of one another and maybe sort of adjust things to suit yourself. And be nice to your supervisor. They're generally very stressed and have lots of work on. So yeah, bringing cake always helps. Or it does with my industrial partner supervisors anyway. But yeah, that's kind of my advice. I'll stop talking because I've probably gone for about 9 years. If anyone's got any questions, just throw them in the comments box, just down there or there, depending on how your screen's set up. And I'll try and answer them later on when we're kind of finished with stuff.
Cool. Thank you, Melanie. You probably can't hear me still, I guess. So,
Not really.
summary. Yeah, that's what Melanie has just told me. Roughly speaking. So, that means what we're doing now is keep moving onwards. Next up, Josephine, over there.
All right. Hi, is this working now? Great. I do have some slides, so let me see if they come up. I'm not sure how to do that. Oh, here it is. Is that showing up?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great. So I'm really happy. I really enjoyed hearing everyone else's advice. So I'll just build on some of the things a little bit. First of all, I'll introduce myself. I'm Josephine, and I'm just starting my 4th year, so I'm basically writing up at the University of Bristol. So let's see. Next slide. All right. So Iain mentioned, maybe you don't actually have a chance to pick your supervisor. So I thought I'd just discuss a little bit about ways that people end up with their supervisors that they end up with, and primarily I think it could be luck, based on whatever project you want to choose. You managed to have an opportunity that came up and you took it, or you might just be looking based on the university you want to attend to or the location you need to be in. And these are all really valid reasons for choosing a PhD project. And so in a sense, you might not really go beyond that to question what you want from your supervisor. So I just wanted to point out some things that I think could be important in terms of the supervisor, and this is like ways to be extra picky in terms of choosing your PhD project in relation to the supervisor that you have. So we talked, the others talked a little bit about the advising style, for example, whether you can, whether they want to see you every week or every day or in the office from 9 to 5, or whether it's more loose, you just email them when you need advice, or you just pop by their office. And then other times you might have a project where it's very, very set in stone. To some extent, that they might say, like, this is a project that's happening, and you might not to be able to feel and how strongly you feel about what you want to be working on, you want to think about that. So that, I think, comes back to Melanie's point about, yeah, she talked about that. So,
Sorry.
yeah, so the next thing was whether you can, whether your supervisor is going to support you to do things externally, whether they have funding to send you on training courses or to conferences. And I think students often come in and they may want to go to a conference every year and then realize their supervisor doesn't have the money to send them. So that's something that you can ask about up front. Something that's come out as really important to me is that it's just sort of the culture and feeling in the group and the department, what it's like, whether people are friendly to each other. And that's not necessarily something you can suss out just from an application or an interview, but it may be worth asking your supervisor if you can talk to some current students or trying to go to some sort of open day, and if they're recruiting a lot of PhD students, the department might be welcoming to that. Or just look around on the website and see, do they have Athena Swan Awards? Or they seem to be active in trying to make people happy. So, but this is a little bit of a tricky thing that you probably don't know until you get there. And then personality, like Iain mentioned, the personal connection, just whether you get along. And you can, if you have connections like through your master's supervisor, an undergraduate tutor or something, or just friends that are doing PhDs already in a similar field, you can ask around and just say, I'm thinking of working with this person. Does anybody know what they're like or have any experience? And that's a really good way to get some advice about whether they're a good person to work with. However, I think you sort of have to be on the lookout if you ask these kinds of questions. So, like, is this a nice person? Is it a good person to work with? Will I be able to, have my input? If you start asking these kinds of questions to other people, like to current students, if they're having problems, they might not necessarily be totally honest about them. So, they might feel like, oh well, we're putting up with this bullying supervisor. You'd hope they would tell you, but you never know. So it's just something to keep in mind, and try to read between the lines of what people are saying if you ask questions. And hopefully you wouldn't be in a position where you'd be working with someone who's not a good person overall. But if you know what kind of fit you want, then finding that out can be very helpful, I think. All right, so the next issue I'm addressing is about expectations. And as Iain said, every supervisor is different. Every supervisor-supervisee relationship is different. And so there will be some guidelines from the university about what's expected in general for a PhD, but because it's such a personal thing, you won't really be able to tell from that what your particular supervisor expects. So as I mentioned, if you can talk to other students that they have, or just ask the supervisor, him or herself. Basically, I think most supervisors that I've come across would be very happy to be honest about what they expect from you. They don't want someone to come in and not be a good fit and then end up leaving or something like that. So you can ask very specific questions, like you can say, I'm really not a morning person. Would it be okay if I did work later, or what's your working pattern, and that kind of thing. So if you have a chance to have an interview or just send an informal email along with the application process, or before applying, then I think these are really good things to ask. This is something that I did with my supervisor. Basically, before I started, I had to move a really long way to start my PhD, so I really wanted to make sure it was the right one. And I had a Skype meeting with my potential supervisor before starting. I had met him in person before, but I was really determined to ask these questions to make sure it was the right fit for me. And I think he was a little bit surprised at how much I was asking, but I think it worked out really well, and it was really comforting for me to know that I could be open and ask these kinds of questions. So that's that. The next sort of question I'm going to discuss is about approaching your supervisor with a problem. So I think a sort of trap that a lot of PhD students fall into is you have some problem or question, and you want to be able to solve it yourself before you go to your supervisor. So you may end up sort of digging yourself into a ditch and not wanting to go and approach your supervisor. Like, time goes on and on and on. Oh, now it's been weeks. How can you say that you're still stuck on this one question? So I think it's really important to have a good relationship with your supervisor, so you don't feel afraid to talk to them. And if you do get into that kind of situation where you have a problem and you're not sure whether to ask about it, if you do have regularly scheduled meetings, of course, I think be honest and bring up those problems that you have at that time. But one thing that I also find really helpful is just trying to write it down in an email. I do a lot of communicating with my supervisor through email because we both are in different places a lot of the time. And when you have to write an email, you have to phrase a question in a concrete way so that you can get an answer. And so often I find when I've written out the problem clearly enough to feel like I can send it to him in an email, sometimes I've solved the problem by the end of that process. But also, if that's not the case, then at least they know what you're working through, and you can send them updates that way, even if you don't have something so concrete to go and ask them. And then, like I mentioned, you don't want to dig yourself into a ditch so you're not accomplishing anything for months. So sometimes I set a deadline for myself saying, if I haven't figured this out by this time, then I'll seek help or whatever. And if you just send a very vague question and say, oh, well, I'm stuck, then they're not going to be able to help you very easily, and they may be less likely to respond quickly, or it might be frustrating for them because they don't really know what to say if you haven't phrased the question. So sometimes saying, well, I think it might be the right thing to do this, but I just want your approval, or that kind of suggestion, I think can be a really good way to communicate with your supervisor. So that would be just trying to think things through and making sure that you're communicating in a way that encourages them to be able to help you properly. So what's next? As I mentioned, trying to talk to other students of your supervisor before you start could be very useful, but once you've started, they're also a really good support mechanism. And Melanie also mentioned if there's a big group, there might be more resources other than your supervisor for people to help. And I found that students and postdocs in the group, and also just maybe in a shared office from a different group or in your department in general, making friends with other PhD students is really, really helpful for your health and progress. So obviously don't assume that you can just ask the person who sits next to you to read a whole thing for you and I don't know, like solve all your problems. But if you have a good relationship with people, they'll be your friends and colleagues, and everyone likes to chat and share their experiences and give advice, and a lot of times these people have been working with the same people you're working with for a long time, and they'll have experience on the best way to approach a problem. And then generally, depending where you are, there will be department level resources and university level resources of other people you can talk to. So in my department, we have general student mentors who you can go to. For example, if you feel like you're having a communication problem with your supervisor, there's a problem that you don't want to go to your supervisor about, and they sort of help to facilitate a discussion between you, or try to solve the problem in an anonymous way. And the university may also have resources as well. So there should be some guidelines online of who you can talk to, or you will have had some induction when you start. And I think it's really important these resources are there for you and to take advantage of them is very helpful. Don't just get sort of stuck and feel like you're all alone. So that's basically everything I wanted to discuss. So the last thing is just my top tip. And as I think I've been mentioning throughout the presentation, I think communication is really important. Don't be afraid to ask questions directly to your supervisor, but be honest with them. And in terms of managing your supervisor and communication, they're very busy people, but I found that sending reminders is something that most supervisors don't mind. So just make sure that you're keeping an active line of communication with them. So I think that's about everything.
Cool. Thank you very much, Melanie. Probably still can't do that was my, that was my summary.
Well, we've got no audio.
Yes, we had this question earlier on. Okay, so as people were talking, I was checking them out, because not all of these PhD schemes are that I'm aware of are necessarily ecology and evolution. That's what I should say. But here is a link to the ones that I know well. So I'm currently based with the Max Planck Society, and they so this is an example. I mean, the Max Planck Society are sort of one organization, but they're composed of I think in Germany they have 84 different institutes, and there are many of these PhD programs that are linked to here, where you can apply with your own idea. And you will then choose an institute and a supervisor to support you through that. And actually, the Max Planck institutes are not able to award their own PhDs. So then you'll, in addition to your Max Planck Institute and your supervisor there, you'll also choose a university to be affiliated with and a supervisor there, and they will award your degree. So it's a very different way of doing things. And they have these in addition to the usual kind of apply for the PhD project type things. I think often you'll find that these sorts of schemes are also advertised in the same way as normal PhDs schemes would be advertised. So you might find them on findaphd.com and things like that. So those are the ones that I know of. I'm sure there are more out there, and I'm certainly aware of certain things outside of ecology and evolution where it's sort of consortia of universities that support these things. So I have a number of friends who are in the European Doctoral School of Demography, and they that's lots of universities from lots of different countries, and although it's not a PhD program per se, I think it's geared at people who want to understand human demography, and people spend some weeks here, some weeks there, learning about all sorts of different things. And then some of those people will already be enrolled in a program, and then other people will be almost guaranteed a PhD position at the end of it. So there are lots of these things out there, and I think here Will has sent a link to one available in the UK as well. So there's more than one way of going about getting a PhD. The other thing I would say is if you have an idea of something that you want to do as a PhD student, then don't be afraid to approach supervisors with that idea. So there are a number of schemes out there for funding. Lots of universities have their own funding, which they will give to PhD students and supervisors, and these will be based on the project, and often it's then the student that goes to the supervisor with the project, and that person then pitches it to the university funding scheme. I have one friend who's doing a PhD, and she knew what she wanted to do. She just had to find the right university, the right funding scheme, the right supervisor, and then she pitched her idea and got accepted. So that's another way to go about it.
So it looks like another question has come in, and Sabina suggested that I talk about this. The question is, let's go back to it. How lengthy, often, and precise should emails be? So I think this very much depends on how often you're communicating with your supervisor in person. But for example, if you're away on field work and your supervisor is back in the office, then I think it's really important that to keep them updated on what you're doing. So I tried to send my supervisor an email maybe once a week if things were going pretty well, or if I had any. I was making a lot of decisions on the fly, and I wanted to sort of confirm them sometimes. But in terms of lengthiness, I don't know. I think if you have a very specific question that you need answered immediately, don't put it at the bottom of a very long email. But if you just are sending an update and you want to make sure your supervisor knows what you're doing, and there's nothing particularly that you need a response on right away, then I think it's okay to write a bit more detail. They don't need to know like every single step that you've taken, but key points on maybe challenges that you're facing that are going to affect the way that you can collect your data. If there's anything that they can do from afar to chip in. So this is just the example of if you're out in the field still. Like, oh well, it looks like the person in charge of the field site isn't going to let me do what I thought they would let me do. That's something that's really important to tell them right away. And because it may be that your supervisor has a different understanding of what you thought than you did on what you thought you were going to do, or they may have a better chance to communicate with the person who's sort of being challenging to you. So your supervisor should be able to support you in that kind of context. And so yeah, being very clear, I think, about the purpose of your email and sort of tailoring whether it's just an update or like please help me right away, everything's going wrong, like can we have a Skype meeting today? Those kind of, like, I think if you just sort of have to play it by ear, and I don't think there's any harm in sending too much detail to a certain extent, as long as you don't expect that they always have I guess read every word and will respond to every hidden question in a lengthy essay. So yeah, tailor it to what you need at that moment.
I think if I butt in here, I think it's a
Well,
fine balance. Oh. Sorry, go on, Iain, go.
Delay. No, it's okay, you go first.
I was just going to say, I think it's a fine balance. So you always want to keep your supervisor within the loop of what's going on with your project. But you also have to be aware that for PhDs, they do expect you occasionally to make independent decisions. And also, if you bombard them with too many emails, you tend to find that you get an even bigger delay in responding. What I've done in the past is send a kind of weekly update at the end of the week on a Friday that I don't need them to respond to, that just kind of tells them what I've done for that week, which I'm never entirely sure if they read or not, but I find incredibly useful because it tells me what I've done for the week. Because sometimes you can get to a Friday and think, I've done nothing, what have I done? And actually, when you put it in an email, you can understand where you've spent your time, and I find that's quite useful to monitor my productivity for a week. But then if you need an urgent answer to a question, I tend to find the best thing you can do is literally put the question in the subject title with the word urgent or need answer next to it. And you tend to find that if you do that and it's just one question, and if you can make it a yes or no question, even better, then you tend to get a very straight answer very quickly. Basically, if you've got a professor or even a senior lecturer, or to be honest, any member of academic faculty, the number of emails that they receive in a day is absolutely unbelievable. So the easier you can make responding, the better. So if you can just do a series of yes or no questions, you're much more likely to get an answer than if you send a sort of a email where they expect an explanation or you need an explanation. But I agree with what Will said actually earlier in the chat box, is that if you can see them face to face, which isn't always possible, then it's always going to be better. Skype is great if you've got the internet connection. I work in remote field sites, so not always reliable. But just popping into their office can be the best way to get an answer if they're around.
I'm going to add a little bit to that. There was a comment from here, how do you deal with a delayed response? What if you need to know something urgently? So face-to-face, or perhaps you have your supervisor's phone number is really good for that. But again, I'm going to come back to sort of my main points is that it's going to depend on the situation between people. And actually, I would recommend sorting out relatively early in your PhD how it's going to work between you guys. Some PhD supervisors might really like this, the sort of weekly thing. Some PhD supervisors might prefer sort of a much more kind of on the go type thing. And the other thing is about, like, you know, when are they going to be available? So and think very pragmatically about how urgent your inquiry is. Can it wait a little bit longer? Because I mean, academics are almost always contactable, and you know, we're like stuck to our phones and our laptops, and we check email when we really shouldn't be checking email. But academics also have other priorities. So if you are a first-year PhD student and you have a sort of what seems to you to be a very pressing problem, then but your supervisor has someone who is just about to finish writing up their thesis, then you've got to be aware that their priority is going to be reading through their other supervisee's thesis rather than dealing with necessarily. So, like, everyone is important, but academics are spread quite thinly. So if you can go to someone else, basically what I'm saying is don't bug people with problems that can be solved through other channels. That's not to say that you shouldn't bug your supervisor at all. That's what they're there for. But sometimes, at least how I'm doing my PhD, that it was easier and better for me to go to someone else to solve the problem first, before, or trying to solve it myself before going to my supervisor.
I think one thing that what Melanie and both Iain were saying reminds me of a really excellent PhD comic, which is in the first frame, the student is sending his supervisor an email about a problem, and then the next few frames he's sending more and more frantic emails with like, oh, I don't know what to do about this, supervisor's sending no response, and then in the last panel, the student sends an email saying, oh, it's okay, I figured it out, and the supervisor responds immediately saying, good. And I feel like this is the kind of thing where, I mean, that just really spoke to me from every supervisor I've ever had. You can work through your own problems, and I think supervisors tend to be really good at assessing when they need to respond, but you don't really want, like Iain said, you don't want to be totally bombarding them. And
it helps you in the long run as well, I think. Sorry, there's a
even
bit
while
delay
you're
going on, so I never know.
Yeah. Even while you're waiting for a response, you can be trying to solve the problem.
Yeah, it helps you as well in the end, I think, because certainly if you do want to then go on from your PhD into research, you have to be very good at working independently, and you'll often find if you're looking for a postdoc position, a lot of the time one of the things listed there will be must be able to work independently, and that's something that you really learn during your PhD. And so sort of solving your problems and using the network of colleagues and friends to help you do that is, I think, a skill that can help you in the long run. Because after your PhD, your supervisor isn't going to be there anymore, and you need to sort of learn to walk on your own 2 feet, and that's harder than it seems sometimes.
Ooh.
Okay.
Interesting. I feel like I should let Will answer this.
I can't speak.
I think one thing
I
is,
might chip in. Is that okay?
Go on, Iain,
Because
start us off.
I've done
yeah.
I've done a lot of different things so far. So I'm now just for the record, I've done my PhD, done one postdoc, and I'm on my second postdoc now, and they've been on very, very different things. And I've also done a lot of collaborative stuff, and some of it I've enjoyed more than others. For me, I would not agree that the process of research is more important than the actual subject. I was told as an undergraduate student, it doesn't matter what PhD you do, you will get involved with it. Like, you will get. Now, I think that maybe for some people that is true. That's not true for me. I've done some collaborative research projects where I think ultimately I wasn't hugely interested in what the answer was, and I found it hard to motivate myself to do the work that I was supposed to be doing for these projects when I just wasn't really interested in finding out what the answer to the question was. And so, no, I don't think that that's necessarily true. But clearly it is true for some people, because other people have told me it doesn't matter what PhD you do, you will get involved with it. The other thing to think about is that sometimes when you do some work, that can kind of guide the rest of your career. If you do particularly well in your PhD, you publish lots of papers, then you might be seen as the person that does that thing. Certainly when it comes to a postdoc, that will happen, or maybe a fellowship. But even at PhD stage, that can happen as well. So I would be a little bit more choosy than just kind of any research project, if it was me.
Yeah, I'm going to kind of add on top of that, I think. So I think it's really important to enjoy research as a process. I'm certainly someone who's jumped around a lot. I started out as a behavioral ecologist as an undergrad, then I did a master's in evolutionary biology, and now officially I'm a soil ecologist. So I've jumped between disciplines because I always knew I wanted to go into research. I was one of those people who walked into the first year of their undergrad and went, I'm going to do a PhD. But I never entirely knew what I was going to do it on, and I've slowly narrowed it down throughout the course of my undergrad to what I ended up doing, which is soil ecology, with a little bit of behavioral biology thrown in that wasn't part of the original project that I've kind of included because that's my area of interest. So it is important to enjoy the process of research. It's important to enjoy the subject. It doesn't necessarily have to be the specific. Chances are there are going to be bits of your PhD that you prefer over others. So you need to enjoy the process of research, but you need to be interested in the subjects sufficiently that if you have something like a final year write-up, which I did, which had to be 30 pages, which happened to come in the middle of my fieldwork season. So I worked every hour God sent, including all weekends. And when you get into that kind of situation where you have to work lots, and I don't know if Josephine's in it with a fourth year write-up, it's really important to actually enjoy the subject content itself, because having a stack of 20 papers that are on a subject that you find interesting is a lot easier than having a stack of 20 papers on a subject that makes you want to run away and scream. So while you need to enjoy the actual process of research, you also need to have at least a basic interest in the subject that you're doing, and it's the balance between the two that's really important. And if you can find a PhD that you really are interested in the subject, and you can adapt it to make it all about what you're interested in, but you also enjoy the process of research, then you'll love every minute of it, hopefully.
I just want to jump in and say I don't think I really agree with what Iain and Melanie have said, but I just wanted to add that I don't think you should go in with the expectation that you're going to love every minute, because the process of research involves some elements of failure, inevitably, some elements of tedium, data entry, this kind of thing. And when you have to have a motivation from somewhere else to push on through, entering numbers into a spreadsheet or whatever. But on the other hand, I think you should also think about the types of research processes which you do enjoy most. For example, I'm really not a lab work kind of person, but I know some people really get enjoyment out of doing that, being in the lab, I guess. As someone outside of that realm, I can't be more specific, but so when you're choosing a PhD, to think about whether is it the statistics and analysis side of things, or the modeling side, or the field work side, or the lab side. I think that can be a really important determinant of what type of PhD you should go for, and what supervisor you should go for, because obviously people take different approaches to their research, and that's not something that we've talked about here, but playing to your strengths and your interests in terms of the methods that are being used, I think could be really important.
One more thing, and then we'll move on to the next question, I guess, is to remember that your PhD is your PhD, and you should be able to advance it in certain ways that you want to. Now, obviously, that you will be within a certain subject area, but I think if there are things that you're keen to do, then you should try and work with your supervisor to make those things happen. And Melanie already said she's interested in behavioral ecology, so she brought that. It was behavioral ecology, yes. She brought that aspect into the PhD, and there usually is scope to do that, and I think a good supervisor will allow you to do that. I wouldn't say that all supervisors will allow you to do that, and there are certain restrictions sometimes from funding schemes. So you'll have this funding, and this funding says that you must do address these points, and so you've really got to be quite focused on those things. But ideally, you should be able to mold your PhD around your own wants, your own desires, because at the end of the day, you're going to have a thesis, and that thesis is going to have your name on it, and you've got to be happy with that piece of work. So, should we go to a current PhD student about finding mentors?
Yeah, I suppose I can kind of pick up on this one a little bit. So, my supervisor is a professor, or my main supervisor is a professor, and he's incredibly busy. He's generally always at the other end of his emails, no matter what time of night. As Iain was saying earlier, academics answer emails at very strange hours sometimes. But he's not always around necessarily to answer the instantaneous in-lab questions like, oops, how do I make this chemical? So it's quite important to find someone that can give you basic on-the-ground advice. And for me, it was really simple. All I did was turn my chair around, and the post behind me is absolutely brilliant at providing help and advice. Some universities will have a mentoring scheme or a tutor scheme that when you sign up to do your PhD initially, you can ask for another PhD student to become your advisor. I actually opted out of that at my university, which was a massive error, because there's nothing more useful than an older student who's been through it all before, and knows the kind of pitfalls that you'll hit. Because remarkably, with a lot of PhDs, you feel like you're on your own and you're the only one having a crisis, and actually everyone around you's having a crisis too. It's just no one talks about it. So it's really nice to have a postdoc there for support. And I would strongly recommend that if you're in a big lab like we are, we have 3 or 4 PhD students and 6 or 7 postdocs, then generally talk to the postdocs. They've been through it all before. Between the 6 of them, they've probably seen every problem that you could throw at them. And they're generally really prepared to give you advice and help, because either they wish that they'd had advice and help before, or they got advice from their postdocs. I tend to find a lot of academia is passing it down from one person to another. So I'd strongly recommend using your own lab group to kind of find people to get involved with, or at least that's how it's worked for me.
Okay, looking at the
I can add to that, and that will probably relate to what I said earlier, is about having good schemes at the universities. Look up whether they have these schemes, because they might actually be a lifeline. I know some people for whom they have been a lifeline. I know for some people, if the scheme was in place, a mentoring scheme, tutoring scheme, then it would have been a lifeline. And the other thing is look at other means, so not just the university, but other means of supervision. And for example, the BES. The BES are really interested in getting more people in their own mentoring scheme, linking up people at different career stages. And so if your university, your research institute doesn't have an adequate mentoring scheme, then look for one elsewhere, and do, you know, join up to the BES one as it develops.
There was that one last question.
Yeah.
That's, while finding a supervisor, would the supervisor accept the student only if they have funding? So this is something that's going to be very context specific, but if there's a type of project you really want to work on and you don't have funding, you can always contact a potential supervisor, and if you they'll have some awareness of potential funding schemes, but I think you have to be aware that it can be really, really difficult, competitive to get these kinds of individual funding. So it's not necessarily a guarantee, but you can always approach potential supervisors. And if they're really interested in taking you on and you impress them, then they'll probably make an effort to point you towards opportunities that they know of.
And I think on top of that, don't necessarily be afraid if it doesn't happen instantaneously. Funding, particularly for a project, if you have it in mind, can be a really long process to get hold of. But generally speaking, so yeah, just noticed the add-on to the question. Generally speaking, it's easier to find a project that's already funded or that's within a competition set of funding. But as Josephine said, that doesn't mean that the supervisor doesn't know another way. They're very experienced at finding funding and pots of money where you'd never normally look for pots of money. So it's always worth dropping them an email to see if they've got anything, or if they've got anything coming up. Some supervisors, if you email them, will have a project in the pipeline that if you've shown an interest before they've even published it, that can sometimes look actually quite good for you in terms of when you eventually submit an application, because you've shown them that you're interested before they've even requested students to show interest. So
If you have funding, so does the supervisor only accept a student if they have funding? I think it would be a very unusual situation if you had funding for a PhD and needed a supervisor. I do know of situations that's happened again. And most supervisors, I think, would be very willing to accept a student who has funding, because essentially it's very little work for them, because a lot of the work is in getting the projects, getting the grants. It's going to be a much more common situation that you have a project but you don't have the funding, and you need to find a supervisor or a scheme which is going to fund that for you. My advice, so I do agree that it doesn't hurt to email people and sort of ask around. Whether or not you'll get a response is another matter. So I don't think it's uncommon for people to email supervisors and say, hey, I'm looking for a job or a project, or let me know. And actually, that's going to be very, very low down on their priority list. If you have a project you want to do, if you want to find a supervisor and find some funding for that project, really, you've got to have a very good idea of what that is. You've got to go to them and say, these are my hypotheses, these are my questions, this is my study area, this is my study species, whatever, because otherwise it's going to be the case that the supervisor is going to have to do a lot more work to get that running. So if you are in the situation that you want that funding, you want that supervisor, I think you've got to have a very clear idea of what you want to do, and then hopefully they will be able to help you find the funding schemes for that.
very much for listening, or not listening very much.
Bye everyone, and thank you.
Thank you.